Joining us now is Forrest Wilder, who's the news and politics editor at the Texas Monthly and the former editor of the Texas Observer, who specializes in environmental reporting and runs the Forest for the Trees blog. Welcome to Background Briefing, Forrest Wilder.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. And I guess if you watch Fox News, and I imagine a lot of people in Texas do, you would think that the state of Texas has been taken over by a bunch of socialist hippies who've implemented the Green New Deal. And in fact, Texas Governor Greg Abbott reiterated that in a conversation with Sean Hannity on Fox News. He said, "Sean, this shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America." And of course, others have. In fact, just Tucker Carlson even took it further. He said the windmills failed like the silly fashion accessories they are, and people in Texas died. So this is a great tragedy due to wind power, according to Fox News. You're on the ground in Texas. I take it that's not the case.
No, not really. It is true that some of the wind farms iced over, and that caused the power generation to go offline. It contributed to the power crisis that we're in. However, wind energy during the winter here in Texas only contributes about 10% of the power that goes onto the grid. The remainder is largely from fossil fuel plants, and the amount of generation that went off from coal plants, a nuclear reactor, and natural gas, vastly outstrips whatever contribution to the outages was contributed to by wind. So I think what's happened here is that this is a ongoing and major energy crisis that's also a political crisis for a lot of the political leadership in the state, and they need someone to blame or something to blame, and wind power has become a convenient scapegoat, and by extension, the Green New Deal, which, needless to say, is not really a factor here in Texas. So they're pointing fingers away from themselves because they, like most politicians, don't want to assume any responsibility for how they might have contributed to this crisis.
Well, Governor Abbott is also pointing fingers at the Electric Reliability Council of Texas, right?
That's right, and ERCOT definitely shares some blame here. But the thing to understand about ERCOT is they're like the air traffic controllers for the electric grid. This is mostly a technical body, not really a policy-making body. We have a Public Utilities Commission that is run by 3 appointees by Greg Abbott, who set rules, regulations, and policies for the electric utility sector in Texas. And we have a legislature that I think this is a really important point that is being lost here. About 20 years ago, Texas deregulated our electric power sector. We went further than any other state, farther than California, in deregulating pretty much every aspect of power generation and the retail side of it as well. That's something that the Texas legislature did. George W. Bush did. Rick Perry and Greg Abbott have also supported electric deregulation, and that's the fundamental feature of this market we have. They've basically turned over power generation and the retail aspects of it to the market. And one thing that means is that we often run on tiny reserve margins. Instead of having regulators sort of saying to the power sector, you need to make sure that you have enough generation online, you need to make sure you're winterizing their equipment, they basically more or less just leave that up to the private entities that are involved in the marketplace. And so ERCOT, again, kind of like the windmills, the wind turbines, is sort of a bit of a scapegoat here.
Well, also Texas is insular from the rest of the national grid, and normally what happens when you have outages in states, they get electricity from other states, and I take it that Texas is not equipped to do that.
Right, and that's a choice to not be connected to other regional grids or to be connected to the rest of the country. Because if we were to do that, then that would bring in federal oversight, and that is a point of pride for Texas that we have our own grid and we're able to do our own thing. I mean, frankly, deregulation wouldn't have been possible, at least to the extent that they did it, if we were interconnected to other grids. The downside of that, of course, is that right now we can't get any help. We're on our own, and that's why we basically had these sustained blackouts for several days now, and the crisis is ongoing, and I don't think we'll be out of the woods here for at least a couple more days. And really, we're moving into the next phase of the crisis, which is about more about water than it is about power. There's pipes are bursting, city water supplies are going down. There's boil water notices, and for all of Houston and for other cities such as Corpus Christi, parts of Austin, et cetera. So we're not out of the woods by a long shot.
And again, I'm speaking with Forrest Wilder, who's the news and politics editor at the Texas Monthly and the former editor of the Texas Observer, who specializes in environmental reporting and runs the Forest for the Trees blog. But is there also a problem with the leadership, with Governor Abbott, the lieutenant governor, who apparently has a peculiar anomaly in Texas where the lieutenant governor has an inordinate amount of power? He's a former right-wing talk show host. And then, of course, you've got the beleaguered attorney general who has all kinds of lawsuits against him involving securities fraud and paying off a mistress. And yet all they seem to do is press these hot-button culture wars issues and obsess about transgender bathrooms and don't seem to be focused on the nuts and bolts of running a government. Is this becoming aware to the people of Texas as these characters scapegoat everybody they can find, including the Green New Deal? Are Texans looking at them and thinking, you guys are on the job and you're failing?
I think it's a little too soon to tell who's going to pay a political price for this. I mean, they are furiously trying to point their fingers, as you said, at the wind farms, at the Green New Deal. A suggestion that somehow, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is somehow responsible for what's going on here. The governor called for the leadership of ERCOT to resign. It might work. I mean, the reality is in 2011, we had a similar event, not as severe, but we had a similar event here in Texas where we had a February ice storm that led to blackouts. People were very upset and were up in arms, and the legislature and governor made a bunch of noise about fixing it, and they didn't. They just maintained the status quo, and 10 years later, here we are again. With that said, people are really angry about this. You got folks that have been going without power, in some cases without water, without an ability to get basic supplies for days on end, and this is happening to millions of people. And I don't care where you are on the political spectrum. That's upsetting, and I think the repercussions of this are not clear. They may get away with not having accountability at the top, but it is an extraordinary moment, and I hesitate to make any predictions. I think that something here probably has to give. It's just hard to say what that's going to look like.
But given that the failures with the grid, is there any talk, and maybe it's too early for this, but is there any talk of maybe going solar at a household level? In other words, it's about decentralizing the grid. If you had solar on your roof and battery package in your garage, if you were off the grid, you'd be fine. Is there any talk of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the individual level, there definitely is. I was just texting with a friend this morning, and he was saying, I'm going solar after this. I'm getting a backup generator. And of course, a lot of people have already done that. The catch is that it's expensive, and so there's only so many subsidies to go around. So the reality is that for most people, they're not going to be able to do that. I think the more promising thing long term is to have a really diversified grid that has, for example, like battery backup for renewables. I mean, the fact is there's a huge success story in Texas with the wind industry. I mean, it's the biggest and most successful one in the country and ranks pretty high in the world. The solar industry has taken longer to get off the ground, but it's catching up. There is an issue that these are intermittent resources, and there needs to be something that looks like baseload generation if we're not going to have as much fossil fuel in the grid, which we're not. That's not the trend. We're moving away from that. So we need, utility scale services such as batteries, and that's coming. And I think that'll help kind of spread out the load, so to speak. But the reality is, so much of what happened here, is preventable regardless of what resources we're counting on to generate power. ERCOT, for example, has no mandate for power generators to winterize their facilities. It's a completely voluntary program. And it just keeps failing. And, they've basically decided that they're going to let the market figure all this stuff out. But what we have here is an enormous market failure. Where are the regulators? They're asleep at the wheel. Where's the governor who's appointing people who oversee this sector? Asleep at the wheel. So you can completely leave aside talk about wind or solar versus natural gas and coal. This thing was, to an extent, preventable, and they chose not to take the actions necessary to prevent it.
And will the wind industry that's taking a hit now in terms of propaganda, but it doesn't have anything to do with reality, my understanding is that wind farms further north, where they are used to the winter freezes, have heaters on them. Will they retrofit wind power with heaters?
I don't know. It didn't happen after 2011. This crisis is much more severe. So I think just based on that alone, it's more likely for it to happen this time. But it's too early to tell. I mean, I think if you're just going to leave the individual entities in the marketplace to decide what the right thing is to do, many of them are not going to do that. They're making decisions based on short-term gain. So if at the end of the day, the people who run the state and the regulators can maintain this sort of hands-off, all voluntary, let the market decide everything approach, this is gonna happen again. So that's their choice. They can choose to try to maintain this, I think, somewhat utopian view of things, or they can get pragmatic and practical, like I think most people expect them to be, and try to fix this thing.
What about a role for the federal government? I know, as you pointed out, the reason that Texas decided to become insular in terms of its grid is because they don't want to have to deal with federal oversight. But what role do the feds have here in trying to fix this mess?
I don't know. It's hard for me to imagine federalization. That's just anathema to the political leadership of the state, and frankly, probably most Texans are not real fond of the federal government. But I know this isn't a very satisfying answer, but it really is it's hard to tell because it's such a fluid situation, both just in terms of the facts on the ground, but also the political ramifications. There are certainly people. There's a hue and cry from, I think, just the public that's learning about all this stuff in many cases for the first time. Many people are asking, why aren't we connected to our neighbors? Why can't we share power? Whether that translates into action once the crisis is passed and the gears of government start turning, I don't know. I think if I was a betting person, I would say it's hard for me to imagine that Texas would willingly submit to FERC oversight, federal oversight. That doesn't seem terribly likely even now.
Well, just in closing, Forrest Wilder, will there be any advantage for the Democrats broadly speaking in the state? They came relatively close in the last election, and of course Beto O'Rourke, who was much touted, came relatively close getting rid of Cruz. I don't know where he stands now, since he's so much associated with the storming of the Capitol on January the 6th. I know I'm forcing you into prognosticating, but how do you see this translating in terms of the effort on the part of the Democrats to pick up Texas?
Oh, well, it's a long ways away to an election, and the world we're living in right now is so chaotic that who knows what we'll be dealing with, a year and a half from now, much less 3 months from now. But I will say that not to dodge your question completely, but our legislature is meeting right now. And there will be hearings on this next week. And I know that there's a lot of Democrats, they're chomping at the bit to have their say about this, including Beto O'Rourke, who is flirting with the idea of running for governor against Greg Abbott in 2022. Democrats in Texas have been out of power for 30 years. They're always looking for an angle. This is unusual just because how many people it has directly affected in ways that are so tangible. Being without power, being without water during a highly unusual winter storm event like this for days on end, and it affecting millions and millions of people. I mean, that is just, needless to say, a highly unusual event. And there's just a lot of ambient anger. I mean, I hear it from people who don't really pay much attention to politics all the time right now. And so can the Democrats capitalize on that? I don't know. I mean, they've failed to capitalize on very much for the past 30 years. So it's hard to say. But if we have a functioning system, someone should pay a price for this. There needs to be some kind of accountability. We'll see what happens.
Well, Forrest Wilder, I thank you so much for joining us here today.
Yep, thank you so much.
And again, I've been speaking with Forrest Wilder, who's the news and politics editor at the Texas Monthly and the former editor of the Texas Observer, who specializes in environmental reporting and runs the Forest for the Trees blog. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with someone who served on the staff of the 9/11 Commission, who joins us to discuss Nancy Pelosi's call for a 9/11-style commission to review the facts and causes of the January 6th insurrection and storming of the Capitol by supporters of Donald Trump.